Hello and welcome to the Tank Index. Today we're going to be talking about a pretty interesting tank in my mind because, the Vickers 600 is an insanely influential tank that, despite setting so many trends and being sold worldwide, the British themselves never bought it, which we'll get into later. But this time we're going to be talking about the Vickers 600, also known as the Vickers Mark E tank. Um, so to provide sort of a backstory and some context here, after the success of the Carden-Lloyd tankettes, John Valentine Carden and Vivian Lloyd were part of another design team. This time, one with the goal to create not a tankette, but an actual infantry tank. But they had created this really light tank that was like, what, 1.5 tons or like 3 tons, I forgot which. It was insanely small. It was only armed with a machine gun. It was a tankette, right? But this time they would make a tank, and just like the previous tankette, it would end up being a brilliant success. So starting off with just some statistics, it was originally labeled the Vickers Mark E before, labeled by everyone as sort of the 6 ton, despite being more like 7 tons. The original version was the Type A, which actually had 2 turrets, both armed with only machine guns. But, that really wouldn't be the popular model. The popular model being the Type B, which had a single turret being a 2-man duplex turret. Which would, after the 6-ton spread worldwide, the 2-man turret would really become the popular and common in tank turrets after this. Before, with the FT, you had a 1-man turret. This could make the 2-man turret common, and then later the 3-man turret would become common with the Panzer III. But the tank was able to go 22 miles per hour, which was very fast. And it weighed technically 7 tons, not 6, but close enough. Its armor was pretty good for the time, having 25 millimeters in the front, a fair 19 in the back at the lowest. And with a 3-man crew, a driver, commander, and gunner, it wasn't as good as a 5-man crew, but considering its size, it was amazing. This thing was better than literally every single tank out there at the time of its, design. It had a leaf spring suspension with 2 axles on either side, each having 2 bogies. It wasn't as good as the Christie suspension, which would, be made around the same time. But it was a really good system for a time and had strong steel tracks that reportedly had like 3,000 miles of life, which was a long time without having to do major maintenance. The Type A only had 2 machine guns. The B had a 47 millimeter gun and a machine gun, which that was a pretty good weapon for the time. Which the standard was sort of a 37 millimeter gun. The engine, however, did have the possibility to overheat, but, with the operational range of 100 miles, that was sort of a worthwhile risk to take. Um, the tank would be designed in 1928, and originally Vickers did try to present it to the British Army, who apparently rejected it due to the quality of the suspension, which is pretty odd considering this thing was a better tank than literally anyone there had. So, my headcanon, this isn't backed at all, this is just sort of what I came up with in my mind. I'm guessing that this was just an excuse instead of literally saying, yeah, we don't want to spend the money to adopt a brand new tank, so we're just gonna say it's not good enough. Which that was fair. This was in 1928. In 1931, the stock market would crash, and after World War One, Britain was pretty bankrupt. So getting a whole new tank, it wasn't really worth it. But even if the British did not like it, that did not prevent the entire rest of the world from absolutely adoring it. Greece, Siam, Finland, Portugal, China, Turkey, and Bulgaria, just to name a few, would be to buy some. The tanks on the left are some Turkish tanks. The USSR would buy many as well and would develop it into their own T-26. Bolivia would use some in the Chaco War, though it wasn't very useful there. And variants of the tank as a cargo carrier would be made as well with the chassis as a basis. And even Japan would buy one as testing. This thing really did go all around the world. And for China, Portugal only bought 2. Some of them bought a few. If I remember right, Siam or Thailand as it would become, would use it in the French Thai War. But China, this was virtually, other than some CV-33s and some Panzer ones. This tank was really all it had against the Japanese when they came rolling in. But as you can see, this thing just went everywhere. To talk about Polish 6 tons. That's a little side note because I am Polish, so I got some national pride up in here. Polish would buy 50 tanks, though apparently would only assemble 38 and keep 12 for spare parts. They would license it for self-production, which would lead to their own 7TP design, which was actually a pretty good tank for when it was made. The Polish ones had larger air intakes, their own machine guns, and a Gundlach periscope on the top, allowing 360 degrees of view from inside the tank. They also gave it a liquid-cooled diesel engine, along with better ventilation, armor, and actually a downgraded 37mm Bofors gun. Though I mean I can understand why, seeing as you can see above, a lot of them stayed with their original twin turret form, though most would be turned into single turret versions later. And the reason they might have done it is maybe just ammunition supplies. It's totally possible that this was really the gun they were using, a 37mm gun, so it makes sense for them to just change it for ammo simplification. By 1939, though, these tanks were really worn out. But they did do better than the Renault R-35s in service, apparently. And they were used in 10th Cavalry Brigade. Though, I mean, a lot of them, by this point, they were worn down. They were just... Not only were there not enough of them left after, wear and tear over the years, they'd probably be suffering through breakdowns and stuff like that. Though, I mean, a tank is a tank. Onto the Soviet T 6 tons. The Soviets liked the tanks they bought, and would get a license to produce as the T-26, which would have over 12,000 made, which is quite a lot. The original models only had 2 DT guns, though later a 45mm gun would be added to those 2 machine guns. The final versions had some sloped armor and welded construction. There were flamethrower and bridge layer variants, and even a radio-controlled demolition tank was built in the chassis, sort of just for trials. But I mean, when the Germans invaded with Operation Barbarossa, I mean, the Soviets really were they kind of wish they had more time to prepare, but obviously they didn't. I mean, it's too late now. So while they were sort of producing other tanks, they sort of just threw all the tanks they had at the enemy, which I mean is a gross oversimplification of their doctrine, but that was part of it. I mean, if you have some tanks in storage, just use them. Like, use whatever we have. So T-26s would be used in World War II, though mostly in the beginning stages of Barbarossa, because once the T-34 was introduced, it was sort of phased out. But the Spanish Civil War, these would see service. The USSR would send some T-26s to fight for the Revolutionary Army in the Spanish Civil War. They would serve pretty well against Italians in the Battle of Guadalajara in 1937, where some tanks would be captured by the Italians, and it would inspire both the M1139 and M1340 Italian medium tanks, which I think is pretty cool. Onto Finland. In 1939, during the Winter War, the Finnish armor force had about 30 FTs, a handful of Cardinaloid tankettes, and 25 Vickers 6 tons. The 6 tons would be re-equipped with 37mm Bofors guns, just like the Polish ones, and really only about 13 of them would get to the front in time to see some action in the Winter War. On February 26, 1940, at the Battle of, Honkaniemi, you guys can wreck me in the comments for that mispronunciation, the Finns used their tanks for the only time against Soviet tanks. Only 6 were actually able to fight, and one of those got stuck in a white tank, so that left 5 6 tons to fight against a bunch of Soviet tanks, dozens of them. They did knock out 3 Soviet tanks before the rest got their asses beat. In 1941, the Finnish would rearm their remaining 6 tons with 45mm guns and labeled them the T-26E. They'd be used in the continuation war with 19 rebuilt 6 tons and 76 modified T-26s, which would continue until the end of World War II, and some would even be kept for training until 1959, when by that point the British and the Soviet tanks were available to replace them as training tanks. Honestly, just like the Renault FT before it, this would be mainly an export. This would, it started out as a tank for the military, Britain or France, and then it would really end up an export tank. But despite just being an export tank, it would be a trendsetter tank design. The FT standardized turrets, and the 6-ton was standardized 2-man turrets, along with giving the trend of the 6-ton infantry tank. It would be used all around the world with many copies and variants made on it, and would inspire many countries to develop tank forces themselves. A lot of them, a lot of countries, maybe during the time of World War I, or directly after, maybe they just didn't have the money to buy some FTs. And by the time maybe in the late 1920s, they did have the money to buy some FTs. I mean, the FT was horribly obsolete, or it was getting there, so they really saw no point. But then the 6-ton launched into the market, and many countries thought, let's just buy some of these and kickstart a tank force. And so this really followed the FT in being this sort of trendsetter design. For final assessment of the tank, the 6-ton really was a good tank. I mean, it was not just exported because there was no export competition. It was exported because it was legitimately a good tank. While not having the best suspension, it had a very durable one, with quite good armor for the time as well. Its twin turret variants were admittedly not the best, but its single turret variant would set a trend all around the world, with the 2-man turret becoming standard. It would be copied by several nations and used by many, even if just for studying, when it was introduced in 1928, it really was a stellar tank, replacing the FT as the world's go-to expert tank. And with some modernizations, I mean, like a new Bofors gun and a better periscope, it was capable to the mid 1930s. And I mean, that's a good 7 years of service, which I mean is pretty good for the tank. Though by World War II, it would be obsolete by then, just because I mean that was a decade later, and I really can't hold that against decade-old design. So I mean, in general, the 6-ton was both another home run for Vickers and another home run for its designers Lloyd and Carden.